Head for the Hills, Hiking My Way Through the Pandemic by Mather Zickel. It was just a chance to get out of the house. July 2020 was a long chapter in a summer of all-consuming dread and gratitude for small blessings. A humbling, exhausting, smothering month that seemed to have no end. So when my friend Zach asked if I wanted to join him on a hike at Mount Baldy, I immediately took him up on it. Zach is a screenwriter who surfs several days a week. Tall and rangy, with a zeal for outdoor adventure, he introduced me to snowboarding at Mammoth Mountain and windsurfing in Costa Rica. I jumped at the offer like a felon accepting bail, even though I had done very little local hiking beyond the well-trod paths of Griffith Park and Fryman Canyon. In fact, I had done very little hiking since I was 13. Having lived in LA the last decade, I had heard of Mount Baldy, but it was an abstract location to me, as vague a destination as El Segundo or the Inland Empire. Nevertheless, the thought of going somewhere new was enough to send me to my closet in search of my boots. I hadn't been anywhere in weeks. One day bled into the next as I took stock of diminishing returns. As a professional actor for the past 30 years, I was used to fallow periods, but this felt different. Early on, 2020 had been shaping up to be a rather productive year for me, with several periods of work out of town. I'd been busy mapping out my travel schedule to New York, to Wilmington, North Carolina, then back to New York, then a few days back in LA before taking off for Winnipeg for 2 or 3 months. My major concern had been leaving my girlfriend Jenny alone with our 1-year-old Hud for such long intervals. Of course, these worries became moot by April when the jobs were first postponed, then finally canceled due to the pandemic. Like many, many others, I had no idea when or if I would be going back to work. Long days at home were filled with reading, changing diapers, yoga videos. For company, Jenny, Hud, and I would routinely gather in the living room at 6 p.m. to listen to our friend Greg broadcast his trance-inducing improvisational music on Facebook. There was nowhere to go, so a day hike was as good as a 2-week vacation. I Googled Baldy, or Mount San Antonio as it's officially known, and was alarmed to pull up a listing on AllTrails that featured a route known as the Devil's Backbone, a 14-mile slog up and down a narrow ridge to a summit of 10,066 feet. Not only was it the highest peak in the San Gabriel Mountains, it was the highest point in Los Angeles County. Had I ever walked 14 miles before? How long would it take? Would we need special equipment? There were warnings posted about hikers sliding to their deaths in deep winter snow. Zach assured me that we'd be hiking a much shorter and less demanding trail to the Icehouse Saddle, a low point between peaks rather than the Baldy summit itself. I agreed to meet him and our friend Vince at the parking lot by the trailhead at 9 o'clock that Wednesday morning. I couldn't wait. 9 a.m. Wednesday, I found myself sitting in a line of halted traffic on Mount Baldy Road. I'd made the hour-plus drive in good time, speeding east on I-210. Now I was going to be late as I idled in a growing caravan of outdoor enthusiasts. I had no cell service, a convenience that immediately evaporated upon entering Angeles National Forest. My agitation grew as I noticed drivers pulling U-turns and doubling back and tried to think of how to contact my friends. I thought I spotted Zach slide past me in his family minivan on the way out of the park. After 15 minutes of inching ahead, I learned from a crew worker that they were resurfacing the road to Icehouse Canyon. He informed me that it would be closed for hours, but that they were convoying cars further up the road to the trailhead at Manker Flat. A nimbus of frustration and helplessness descended on me as I was shunted into a small flotilla of cars being shepherded along the uphill road. At the crest, I suddenly spotted Vince in the opposite lane headed back down. Honking, yelling, I cranked the wheel and fell in behind him. We pulled over at the first turnout and popped out of our cars. He stood compact in hiking shorts and a wide-brimmed sun hat. Vince and I have been good friends for over 20 years and one-time neighbors when we both used to live in Hell's Kitchen. Dark-haired and beaming a smile, he radiated an effortless positivity that I've come to see as a harbinger of good tidings. I was thrilled to have found him. Then I lost my temper. I had returned to L.A. about 2 weeks earlier after visiting my family in upstate New York. Over Memorial Day weekend, my father went to the hospital after having suffered a stroke. I'd managed to get him on the phone after he'd been admitted, but his speech was thick and slurred. It was hard to tell how cogent he was, and the conversation was short. My father always hated talking on the phone, even in the best of health, so I said I'd try him the next day. It was the last conversation we would ever have. My brother Reese informed me that he had had another episode and was placed in a medically induced coma. Things were moving fast. My girlfriend Jenny immediately booked me on the next available flight to New York. The day before I left, we hosted a barbecue, a gathering we'd already planned and decided not to cancel. In the bedroom, I packed my bag as I listened to friends laughing and drinking on the patio. I tried to be philosophical about the situation as I mingled and mentioned to people that I had to leave in the morning as my father was likely about to die. Zach was among our guests. He clapped a hand on my shoulder and offered warm condolences. I sipped a cocktail and smiled back, but I was experiencing dissociation. The LA sunshine flooded our backyard, uninvited and indifferent. 24 hours later, I stood at the JFK arrivals curb at dusk. I folded up the KN95 mask that a neighbor had kindly offered me for the flight and sealed it in a Ziploc bag. Reese's car pulled up, and within minutes we were heading north on the Hutchinson Parkway. Reese is a structural engineer who lives with his wife and 3 young children on the Upper East Side. Capable and unsentimental in equal measure, he had been on hand for our father's repeated health crises of the last few years. Our conversation was fitful as we sped upstate into the falling dark. During the drive, we received alerts on our phones announcing a curfew in Manhattan for that night. It was a week since George Floyd had been killed in Minneapolis on Memorial Day. The wave of protests that had burst out in every major American city showed no signs of abating. Curfews had been instated all over the map as peaceful demonstration often gave way to disorganized mayhem as soon as the sun went down. The nation was in the throes of upheaval and division, any common narrative having come unraveled. The system seemed poised for a reordering, a remaking in an image no one could quite envision or articulate. As the twilight settled over New York State, I felt as if I were awakening from a lifelong dream of the elemental solidity of my country, where the myths I'd been raised on were exposed as phantoms. And yet without those myths, I wondered where our cohesion was as a people. America was unrecognizable. My father would never know of George Floyd or the movement launched in his name. He lasted about a week, comatose. Reese and I visited him in the hospital one at a time as per COVID restrictions. I spoke to him, held his hand, and sang him songs in the hope I could amuse or even annoy him, anything I could do to get him to respond. I couldn't stop looking at the white ruff of downy stubble on his neck. His beard had never been this long in his life, adding to my disbelief that this unkempt convalescent could actually be him. 2 days later, my brother and I watched as they took our father off life support. He stopped breathing in less than 5 minutes. Immediately, a silent clock started in my head, marking all of the time that he would not be coming back from that moment on. The following week was consumed with the business of burying a parent. I called friends and relatives while Reese dealt with the funeral home. I offered to write an obituary and dug through old documents stowed in green tab folders hanging in my father's desk. I found his resume and was freshly awed by the many accomplishments of his professional life. A familiar, childlike admiration for his career as a surgeon and an inventor rose up in me like the chorus of an old song. I did my best to honor him in print. The obituary was submitted to the paper, a simple wooden casket was chosen, and a small gathering of friends and family met at the cemetery on a beautiful sunny June day. There was no service nor officiant, just as he had wanted. Reese and I delivered memorial words to the small company. It was hard to tell how much our mother heard or what she thought of what we said. She was confined to a wheelchair, having fallen victim to a debilitating and progressive neural disease a few years before. She was rational and present, but her speech had begun to disappear much in the same manner as her ability to use her limbs had. A slow but steady retracting. I stayed at the house after the funeral to spend more time with her. Once the necessaries had been attended to, and the shock began to dull and the conversations had been had, a deep emptiness settled over me. There was nothing more to do, and nothing on the horizon. I went to the grocery store. I stared at CNN as Trump senselessly held aloft a Bible at St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington after having dispersed protesters with tear gas. I read the latest Louise Penny mystery to my mother and watched countless syndicated episodes of Law and Order with her. Silence visited often, like an awkward guest. I could still hear the reverse clock tick of my father retreating into posterity. When I finally decided to return to California, to leave my old home for my new one, my mother told me that she hated to see me go. It was a ritual conversation that we had repeated over the last several years of visits. I felt guilty going back, a sense that I was leaving a job unfinished and yet uncertain about what the job actually was. I looked around the house that I had been brought to the day I was born and wondered how many more times I would step inside it. I stood on the turnout by Mount Baldy Road and railed at Vince. I went on about the idiocy of Caltrans or whoever decided to resurface the road to Icehouse Canyon on this particular day. My voice rose as I decried the lack of signage near the entrance to Angeles Forest and the fact that there was no way of contacting anyone. This new roadblock seemed like a link in a chain of systemic failure. Did nothing in this country work anymore? Vince nodded in sympathy, yet seemed to take it in a less personal way. Perhaps the mountain air was affecting me. I was having difficulty drawing a full breath. It was unsettling that the outdoors should feel slightly suffocating. While Vince and I discussed our options, we were suddenly stunned to see Zach's minivan turning up the road toward us. We waved and shouted with excitement as he rolled into the turnout and leapt out with a wide grin. Instinct and rerouted traffic had brought us all together. Fate meant for us to carry on. We would find a different trail to hike. After relocating to Manker Flat, each of us grabbed his day pack and started up the path. I stopped to examine a colorful trail map that reminded me of a Chutes and Ladders board. The notorious Devil's Backbone curled in a long stitch around the profile of Mount San Antonio. Then I noticed a short, bright candy cane zigzag called the Baldy Bowl Trail that ran up the face of the peak and was listed at a mere 3.4 miles. We moved on until coming upon a full view of the San Antonio Falls tumbling down a high cliff in a long, narrow stream. The morning sunlight illuminated the cascade like a benediction. Less than a mile past the falls, the gently rising service road intersected with a thin dirt path that cut steeply up the mountainside. A simple wooden sign announced it as the Baldy Bowl Trail. We looked at each other in consensus. This was to be our hike. Close to 2 hours later, we were still rising up through a forest of yellow pine, scrub oak, and chaparral. Small groups of hikers who had preceded us by hours bounded down the trail past us toward the bottom. Perspiring heavily, Zach, Vince, and I muttered quick greetings and yanked bandanas over our faces, the specter of contagion momentarily haunting the pristine surroundings. Many were arrayed in the latest gear, light windbreakers and low trail shoes. Quite a few carried walking poles, a bit of equipment that seemed excessive to me. I asked a pair of young women if we were approximately halfway to the peak. They chuckled and estimated perhaps a third of the way up, and that we would be coming upon the ski hut soon. They carried poles and didn't seem at all winded. They exhorted me with bright cheers of, "You can do it!" I thanked them and immediately internalized their encouragement as a kind of challenge. They meant well, but it sounded bland and slightly condescending to my ears. I was at least thankful they hadn't told me that I got this, or even worse, that I was killing it as I quickened my pace with long muscular strides up the slope. Before long, the trees thinned and we came upon a green wooden cabin, the San Antonio ski hut. A host of other hikers rested outside, taking shelter from the noonday sun. We learned that the hut was originally built by the Sierra Club's ski mountaineers in 1937 and remains open to this day. It's a rustic 2-story shelter with a kitchen, running water, and a wood-burning stove. It's also available for overnight rentals. The three of us claimed a few seats rough-hewn out of tree trunks and settled down on the deck overlooking the steep gorge. We guzzled water and tore into our sandwiches. We lolled in the heat and proposed future plans to rent this cabin and spend the night. A satisfied silence fell on us as we took in the view, and I could feel that we were at a crossroads, our turnaround. I gazed up the sheer sandy bowl to the rim that towered hundreds of feet above us, a long edge of cliff framed by nothing but the cobalt sky. I had turned 50 in April. At the time, I had hoped to spend the occasion like I had my 30th and 40th birthdays, by traveling somewhere I'd never been. Instead, I spent a quiet day with my family before an early dinner. I was still adjusting to fatherhood. Jenny and I had given up on the idea of becoming parents after being childless for 13 years. Then HUD had suddenly come to live with us in April of 2019. Jenny had a family member who was unequipped to raise a child, and HUD needed a home. We'd rushed to get our house ready. Friends and family were delighted to give us clothes, toys, and furniture. I installed safety gates to prevent him from somehow crawling into the washing machine. In the eyes of the state, we were perfect candidates to become the foster parents of a 10-week-old boy. Inside, I felt woefully unprepared. Did I have the capacity to be a father? What kind of guidance could I give him? I would be categorically unfit to help him with his math homework. Plus, when he turned 10, I would be nearing retirement age. I imagined trying to play touch football with a cane. But when the pandemic erupted, HUD became the saving grace of our daily life. He was a delightful little fellow who loved music, garbage trucks, and the moon, and he brought purpose and love to our family lockdown. As it turned out, I celebrated my mid-centenary the way many others did who had been born in 1970, on Zoom. Having a birthday party on an app developed for remote business meetings was one of the more claustrophobic features of the pandemic. While it's touching to see a group of loved faces from your life, it lacks all intimacy. It's like watching a living photo album. You have no opportunity to connect with any particular person. Furthermore, you are thrust into the position of moderator, constantly throwing to one person or another more in the manner of an ad agency's creative roundtable than a cocktail party. The benefit of Zoom is seeing people who you rarely keep up with and might not have seen if you had had an actual party at a location. I was moved to see faces from the past lit by ring lights, or candles, or desk lamps, peering out of semi-shadow from the safety of their homes, each one recalling different lives I had lived. As people made jokes and drank or just stared out of the screen, I thought of how and when I would see them in person again. I was thankful for having enjoyed their company. A 50th birthday party celebrates the evanescent. It was noon. We'd been hiking for 2 hours. There was plenty of daylight left, and the thought of going back was dissatisfying. As we finished our lunch, I proposed that we press on to the summit. Vince raised his eyebrows, but was hesitant. We hadn't planned for a hike of that length or even discussed a destination since our original Icehouse saddle plan had been scuttled. I asked Zach if he wanted to go on to the top, trying to appeal to his reckless side. He pursed his lips and thought for a few seconds before offering that we return another day. The opportunity was slipping away. I became adamant. "What other day?" I blurted. "We're here. It's only noon. The weather's perfect and we have nowhere to be. This is the day." I shamelessly added, "It's not like we're getting any younger." Zach stared at me, deliberating for a long moment before giving a single decisive nod. "All right, I'll do it." Vince hated the idea of being left out of an adventure more than the idea of continuing and quickly threw in with us. We would carry on as a trio. Leaving the ski hut behind, we began to traverse the face of the Baldy Bowl. Just a few yards from the hut was a small meadow of thick green grass speckled with red and yellow wildflowers. The air was cooler here, and we discovered a bubbling stream. This small oasis was the head of the San Antonio Creek that sprang high out of the side of the bowl and eventually became the waterfall we had seen at the bottom. We splashed our faces and soaked our bandanas before continuing across the middle of the bowl to where the sandy fell field above us ended in a confusion of boulders. We'd arrived at a different planet with new terrain. The trail became obscure here, like a dry creek bed. Picking our way through this stone garden to the other side of the bowl felt like some adventure game one naturally invents in childhood, more so as we were dwarfed by many of the largest rocks. Things immediately stiffened on the far side of the bowl. The trail snaked up the mountain at 45 to 50 degrees of incline. We scrambled up switchbacks of gray, gravelly scree, thighs and calves burning. We would pause for breath while propped against spindly lodgepole pines to prevent backsliding. Zach was almost bent over double, grasping at roots and trunks to use as handles, his running shoes slipping under him in the loose earth. I kept my eyes on the ridge above us. The summit couldn't be much further, I told myself, remembering the entire trail was only 3.4 miles. Like a sprinter stretching for the finish line, I pushed onto the top where it opened out onto a wide flat populated with low patches of manzanita and various species of conifers. Just beyond, a sharp rocky peak jutted into the sky. Panting, I approached a wooden sign with an arrow that read Baldy Summit. A wave of excitement swept over me, blending with the cocktail of adrenaline and lactic acid that coursed through my veins. The peak was a short climb ahead. It had been hidden from sight by the rim of the Baldy Bowl. I grinned at Zach and Vince as they joined me at the sign to catch a breath and rehydrate, taking small sips to conserve their dwindling supplies of water. Vince mopped his brow and glanced skeptically at the tall stone mount before us, the struggle up the last slope having sapped a good deal of his enthusiasm. I optimistically declared that the peak must be our destination. He shot back that he wasn't interested in speculating. As we scaled the next steep rise, I began to harbor doubts. The sharp peak was revealed to be the outcropping of a long bluff that stretched out behind it. It was unclear which of the tracks weaving between the dense islands of Manzanita was the proper one, but all of them continued upward at a vertiginous angle. We struggled up the bluff in short, labored bursts. A passing middle-aged couple told us there was perhaps a mile more and that we were almost there. My celebration had been premature. I'd been fooled by a false peak and had no idea what it was I was looking for. Zack shared a few shards of chocolate before we trudged on, tapping into whatever wells of energy we still possessed. The enormity of the hike was finally sinking in, and I wondered whether I had the stamina to finish. Our steps were leaden, and we stopped frequently. I moved as if through gauze and considered taking a nap. All of my concentration was bent toward the simple task of continuing, walking, putting one foot in front of another. We reached the final slope in a long, ragged column, each of us shuffling uphill in exhausted silence. And then we were there. A stiff wind caused me to look up from my feet. Baldy was true to its name, a broad, dusty, treeless dome. Zack nodded at me, his toothy smile bright at the center of the open summit. I made my way over to him beside the iron plaque that has greeted decades of hikers. San Antonio, Mount Baldy, elevation 10,064. Vince joined us moments later, and we all stared out in stunned appreciation at the vista surrounding us. Sky and horizon stretched out forever as we took in the view from the very highest point in Los Angeles County. I could see the long, thin line of road that we had driven into the mountains, but it was way too high to actually make out any surrounding buildings. The world resolved into grand scale. We weren't looking at objects. We were looking at land masses. A corona of mountains encircled us. To the east, I-15 was two gray snakes undulating through the Cajon Pass up into the Mojave Desert. A single-engine airplane buzzed lazily by 100 feet below us. Spread across the summit were low semicircles of stacked stones occupied by groups of hikers taking shelter from the wind. We dropped our packs to rest in a vacant shelter, and the muscles in my inner thighs began to spasm. Zack and Vince finished off the last of their water, having only brought enough for a 4-hour hike. Ever since I read the dire AllTrails posts about the Devil's Backbone, I had taken the precaution of packing the recommended minimum 3 liters. I still had about half my supply left, which we split among us. As we rested, we nodded casual greetings to other hikers and basked in our accomplishment, having joined the Society of Baldy Summiteers. Half an hour later, we bounced down the mountain at a lively clip, reinvigorated by rest and the glow of triumph. With practiced eyes, we took in the trail in reverse, the steep bluff we had once taken for the peak, the pine flat that made a natural campsite, and marveled at the slope we had just climbed. The hard part being over, we chirped magnanimous encouragement to ascending hikers. I might have even told someone that they could do it. We attacked the precipitous drop below the rim of the bowl like skiers in fresh powder, riding the scree down the switchbacks with childlike abandon. At the bottom, we cut across the boulder-strewn bowl in the direction of the ski hut. 50 yards into the traverse, I suddenly realized that I couldn't see the trail. The white rocks were arbitrarily scattered about the field, lying as nature had left them. It was the right direction, but as I couldn't actually see the hut, I didn't want to take any chances. As Vince came up behind me, I asked him if he could pick out the path. We both stood perplexed, unsure of where we'd gone astray. Retracing our steps, we looked for our last landmark, but could find no sign. It now seemed as if there were several possible paths, or possibly none at all. Zack scampered back up the slope to see if we had missed a turn and disappeared into the trees. The thought of following him up the grade was disheartening. All of the sprightliness I felt after our rest at the summit drained out of my legs like water. Speaking of which, I was down to my last couple of swallows. Zack shouted down that he couldn't see the path. The afternoon sun slanted down at a low angle from behind the ridge, casting Vince and I in creeping shadow. The day was fading fast. I couldn't spot any of the hikers we'd seen at the summit and wondered if we were the last group on the trail. Vince asked me, "Could you imagine spending the night out here?" It was a question that I was considering myself at that moment. Between the sheer pitch of the slope and the boulder field, there would be nowhere to lie down. I thought of night drawing on and the rapid drop in temperature it would bring. I wondered what sort of wildlife claimed this area as its hunting ground. Most immediately, I considered how long one could spend in this environment without water. It became more and more apparent to me how crucial a supply of water was and how many disasters were predicated on not having enough. Even though I was looking out at a gorgeous mountainside thick with green tree canopy, I knew that what I was actually seeing was subalpine desert. A discordant sensation of being trapped out in the open air settled on me as I felt my tongue dry inside my mouth. Zack slid back down the trail from his unsuccessful reconnaissance mission. Behind him, a lone middle-aged man appeared, taking measured strides down the switchbacks. He was dressed in windbreaker, trail shoes, and walking poles that cushioned his steps. We called out to him, asking for directions. Without a change in gait, he gestured ahead with his pole and disappeared among the boulders on the trail, now clearly visible. I had made one wrong turn around a massive rock and gotten off track. The mounting panic in my chest dissolved, and I felt grateful that my lesson in respecting the outdoors came at such a low price. Approximately 2 hours later, we tiptoed to the bottom of the Baldy Bowl Trail and stepped back onto the wide service road that wound down to Manker Flat. Hips, knees, and especially feet ached in protest at the unexpected abuse they'd received. If any of us had assumed that the trip down the mountain would be different than the journey up, they were proven correct. It was worse. Climbing a peak is muscular aerobic exercise, a fantastic workout for your calves, hamstrings, heart, and lungs. Descending is a bouncy, jangling shock to your joints and ligaments. The balls of your feet and the tips of your toes swell and even bruise from being mashed into your boots as you pound down a rocky incline for hours. Lower back muscles clench in an effort to maintain balance. The wisdom of using walking poles was now clear to me. We had hiked for 7 hours and climbed almost 4,000 feet in 3.5 miles. As we rounded the turn toward the waterfall, I looked up at the rim of the bowl soaring high above us in the distance. It seemed impossibly far. 7 hours ago, I wouldn't have imagined ever being able to reach it. I pointed it out to Vince and Zack with pride. "Can you believe we walked up there today?" I asked. The summit of Baldy was tucked far beyond the horizon, well out of sight. It now seemed as real as the city of Oz. Vince shook his head and smiled. "I'm glad I had no idea what we were in for," he said. "If I did, I never would have gone." Southern California is banded by the transverse mountain ranges. These are unusual in that they run east to west, as opposed to the north-south formations in the rest of the state. The mountains formed during the early Cenozoic era, tens of millions of years ago, as the Pacific tectonic plate subducted beneath the North American plate. The San Andreas Fault demarked this violent collision in a series of fractures running from northwest to southeast. The landmass closest to the ocean concurrently rotated 80 to 100 degrees, throwing up the transverse ranges that run from Santa Barbara to the Coachella Valley. The San Gabriels are tucked into the central segment of these ranges, dominating the view north from downtown LA and stretching east to the Cajon Pass, through which the San Andreas Fault runs right below I-15. The eastern peaks that abut the fault are the highest in the range and include Mount San Antonio, or Baldy. These peaks remain geologically active to this day. Baldy had inspired us. Vince sent out a list of numerous local hikes and suggested we hit all the highest peaks in the transverse ranges. There were several in LA County alone and more that were within a couple hours' drive. A goal was taking shape, provided a badly needed distraction from the pandemic's vacuum of boredom and despair. I examined maps and researched the best trails in the area. I would jog around my neighborhood and gaze at the high, jagged horizon as if for the first time. The topography of Southern California was unfolding before my eyes, and I saw that it was a hiker's paradise. The very next week, we hiked Verdugo Peak, the pinnacle of the dusty, shrub-covered Verdugo Range that forms a barrier to the northeast of Glendale. It sounded like an easy conquest after Baldy, clocking in at a mere 3,126 feet and being only a 20-minute drive from my door. And yet the mountain humbled us again. We sweated on an exposed trail called the Vital Link in the glare of the late morning sun as it shot up 1,700 feet over a mile and a half. I scrabbled at the hard-packed earth with the new hiking poles Jenny bought for me like a wounded crab. Zach sported new Merrill hiking boots, replacing the running shoes he'd worn at Baldy, but still slid on the loose gravel. Vince hadn't brought enough water once again and was parched in the relentless baking heat. We chewed our sandwiches at the transmission station at the summit and took in the long westward view of the San Fernando Valley. A column of smoke billowed out of the Cahuenga Pass from some accident on the 101 freeway. In the southern distance, we could just make out Catalina Island shrouded in ocean mist like Avalon. Between the two, Vince pointed out our next destination on the horizon, the Santa Monica Range. The Santa Monica Mountains make up the greater part of the western segment of the Transverse Ranges. They run from Point Mugu on the coast of Ventura County eastward across LA, ending in Elysian Park near Dodgers Stadium. Because they include the Hollywood Hills and Griffith Park, they form one of the most populous protected natural areas in the country. Wildlands in the very midst of urban sprawl. 20 million years ago, this part of California didn't exist. Then Pacific lava vents cracked open and started spewing volcanic rock formations up out of the water. A few million years later, we had Hollywood, as well as the Malibu coastline and the Channel Islands off Santa Barbara. It was an age of tremendous upheaval, erosion, and low housing prices. The Santa Monicas shot up to 10,000 feet before they were ground down to their current elevations. Today, the highest of these breast the Malibu coastline, culminating in Sandstone Peak at 3,111 feet tall. Zach wasn't able to meet Vince and I for the Sandstone hike, but our friend Declan was game. A cinematographer, former rugby player, and father of three, Declan is large and sturdy with a wild shock of gray and white hair. We rolled into the parking lot in Malibu to find Vince already waiting for us in the cool, damp morning, the entire area hushed by low Pacific cloud cover. The landscape here was layered in hues of straw yellow, umber, and deep waxy green, and the smell of ocean salt filled the shallow canyon that we walked through. The plant life and rocks were different from the pines and white granite of the San Gabriels. The Santa Monicas piled up around us in large brown dollops like giant chocolate chips. After the last hot, dry hikes, this trail felt actually temperate, as if we were on a Mediterranean holiday in rainy season. Sandstone graced us with a stunning view of the Oxnard Plain, the Channel Islands, and, of course, the Pacific. I couldn't wait for our next outing. The hikes were becoming regular events, and I was invigorated at discovering the new peak of the week. Then came the fires. August and September of 2020 saw a new level in the long history of California wildfires. No one had ever seen the size and number of conflagrations that exploded that summer. Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency when over 350 blazes were recorded across California. The August complex was the largest, burning over 1 million acres of land across 6 northern counties. Conditions of drought earlier in the year caused the forests to dry significantly. Excessive heat led to the lightning storms that ignited many of the blazes that were then fanned by the arid seasonal winds of late summer. These were the wages of climate change, plus a few incidents of arson. LA County was most affected by the Bobcat and the Lake fires, both of which started in the Angeles National Forest, home to the San Gabriel Mountains. Ash fell across our neighborhood from a sky the color of dirty cotton. The local news told us to stay in our homes to avoid the hazardous air quality. The sun glowed a menacing blood orange. These dire conditions were coupled with the worst heat wave in California history. On September 6th, the thermometer spiked at 121 degrees in Woodland Hills, an all-time high for Los Angeles. We had days on end of triple-digit figures throughout the valley. People already apprehensive about going outside because of the coronavirus were now told to stay in their homes because of the air. Hiking was no longer an option. I felt more trapped than ever. I tried to be grateful for the positives in my life. Jenny, Hud, and I were all healthy. We hadn't lost our home to a fire or had to evacuate like so many did. I was still able to pay my bills despite my unemployment. Somehow we were still here, and every day was a chance to improve one's perspective. I read A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman, her history of life in a plague-ridden 14th century Europe, in hopes that learning how humanity had somehow survived previous cataclysms would bring me comfort. I considered my own capacity for suffering and how I had never been truly confronted with it, how I had been spared want and illness my entire life. I meditated and tried to broaden my acceptance of that which I could not control. I aspired to behave with patience and compassion and dignity. But really, I felt hopeless. The end of everything I knew and believed in felt imminent. I needed to spend time with my mother. So, Jenny suggested that we drive across country to visit her. Jenny had bought a 2020 Honda Odyssey after HUD came into our lives. Her 2008 Prius had served commendably, but now the era of the minivan was upon us. She insisted that the Odyssey would not only be a concession to child-rearing, but also an opportunity for adventure. The car would live up to its name when we took road trips. In truth, I did find the roomy cabin and captain's seats comfortable and conducive to cruising. Even HUD seemed pretty content strapped in his child seat. On October 26th, we stowed our bags, birthed our 2 dogs, Joe, Rufus, and Gertie, Joe in the back seat next to HUD, Gertie in a small bed placed in the footwell of the front passenger seat, and left town. Our Polestar would be the first La Quinta Inn sign we came across every 500 miles, since almost all La Quintas accept pets. We sped past Utah's haunting Martian landscape, through the snow-capped Rockies, into the endless unbroken prairie of Nebraska until we made Des Moines on day 4. Here we would spend the better part of a week with Jenny's sister and brother-in-law who had left LA for Iowa 3 years before. Our visit coincided with the presidential election. COVID infections were rising with the colder weather, and this became the defining issue of the 2020 campaign. The massive human toll of the pandemic was impossible to ignore, and the White House had no answer for it. Indeed, it seemed to admit tacit defeat. The policy of the Republicans was a shrugging, cynical fatalism. Most of the electorate was howling for a change, or at least a semblance of a plan. And yet here in the heartland, the Democratic Party didn't appear to have a presence of any kind. Aversion to masks was as prevalent as the massive red and blue Trump banners strung above I-80. Election day came and went in Des Moines without fanfare or uproar. I had personally elected not to spend a moment in front of a television watching the returns. Jenny and I had mailed our ballots in weeks earlier, and I couldn't stomach the primary-colored roller coaster ride of cable news coverage. At breakfast the following morning, Jenny's brother-in-law Anthony told me that the returns were still coming in. It was clear that the election wouldn't be decided for days or even weeks. I was dismayed that Trump wasn't quickly walloped in a rout and realized that I didn't know what sort of country my fellow Americans wished for. I had expected street violence, imagined a semi-organized cadre of bikers with AR-15s massing at the White House to support the president. Instead, people seemed to simply go about their business on November 4th. We left Iowa without knowing who won. When the news declared Pennsylvania and thus the election for Biden some days later, we were staying with Jenny's brother outside of Cleveland. I had a fantasy of the former president being escorted from the White House by his own secret security detail on January 20th. We made the drive from Cleveland to my mother's house in about 8 hours, and once arrived, slipped into the languid pace of life on the dirt road. I took comfort in the dampness of November in the Northeast. The leaves were down from the maples and oaks and birches, but I felt life in the rushing brook, the wet grass, and the moisture in the air. I particularly enjoyed the rainy, overcast days that we have so rarely in Southern California. I watched the Giants stumble forward to their first victory over the Eagles in 4 years with my brother and my nephew James, and avoided the political news. I would drift into the living room where my mother's face would light up from her automatic recliner, and we'd chat. We would try to continue the dialogue that we'd maintained for most of my life, an open-ended conversation regarding all manner of topics. Now we were confounded. She by her physical difficulties, me by my lack of fresh material. Occasionally I could get her to laugh, amused as she was by the small indignities of life which she now experienced on a daily basis. I wanted to protect her in the same way I'd wanted to when I was a child. My mother had always been the beating heart of a home full of men. She had taken care of me, my brother, and my father as long as she was able, and had done so with selflessness and great love. She was more comfortable going unnoticed, taking pleasure in our accomplishments than pursuing goals of her own. Indeed, our accomplishments often became those goals. Now, to her chagrin, she had become the mute center of attention in the house. The idea that her children should have to take care of her was appalling to her, but she was still happy that I was there to lift her into bed and watch TV with her until she fell asleep. Jenny and I packed up the Odyssey and headed south the Saturday after Thanksgiving. We shot down the length of the New Jersey Turnpike, across the Delaware Water Gap, through a 6-ambulance accident in Maryland, and into Virginia. The following day, Jenny insisted on taking a tour through D.C., where we passed protest signs hung along the fence on H Street behind Lafayette Square. It was here that Trump had staged his Bible photo op several months earlier. It was as close as an uninvited person could get to the White House, which stood distant and barricaded from all directions. We stopped long enough for Joe and Gertie to relieve themselves in front of the ellipse. The following day, we passed through Roanoke, where I'd performed in a production of Romeo and Juliet sometime during the last century, before picking up the Blue Ridge Parkway. The weather turned to thick rain and fog that steamed up the windows. Jenny would point excitedly at remote farmhouses that emerged like blurry phantoms as we wound slowly through the sodden mountains. I wondered if there was sanctuary to be found inside these old homesteads. By nightfall, we were crawling down a slick, frozen interstate in a central Tennessee blizzard. Barbecue in Memphis, crawdads and boudin in Louisiana, a gas station beer in Texas, enchiladas in Santa Fe, something in Flagstaff, 6 weeks, 7,500 miles, and we were home. The new year dawned on a Los Angeles overwhelmed by coronavirus. We ushered in 2021 with a hike up Oat Mountain. Rising above the city of Chatsworth, Oat is the highest point in the Santa Susanas, where a paved service road led us past oil derricks, a police helipad, and the crumbling remnants of a Cold War-era missile launch site. Our group grew to include our old friend Patrick. Tall, thin, bearded, and bespectacled, Patrick has the bearing of a politically radical academic from the 1960s. He was an enthusiastic hiker and was curious about the peak of the week. But now, 1 in 3 LA residents had potentially been infected with COVID-19, and more than 11,000 had died. The hospitals were flooded beyond capacity. Ambulances were turned away from emergency rooms or sat parked outside for hours at a time. Due to the limited supply of oxygen, a memo was issued from emergency medical services to first responders telling them not to deliver patients suffering cardiac arrest who couldn't be revived in the field. A grim triage was in effect. It was essential to avoid the hospital at any cost. A new vaccine was on the way, but it was uncertain how long it would be until it became available to the general public. Once more, we were siloed back into isolation. Just 4 days after we hiked Oat Mountain, Jenny hollered at me to come look at the news because people were trying to break into the U.S. Capitol. We watched as they gradually made their way up the stairs, expecting some force to turn them back at any moment. When it became clear that neither a riot squad nor the National Guard was coming to support the meager police presence on the steps, the insurrectionists proceeded to smash in windows and penetrate the building. It occurred to me that reinforcements were being intentionally delayed, and most likely by the president himself. That night, in what felt like a glum return to the early days of the pandemic, my friends and I discussed this disaster on Zoom. Several of my peers were of the mind that America's time was at an end, that we'd had a good run of it, but that zero-sum power politics was proving too much for the fragile machinery of democracy. The system was too vulnerable to a mass authoritarian movement from the right. On the other hand, some posited, if the system is irreparably racist, elitist, and unfair, why should anyone defend it? I'd grown up with the belief that with all America's faults and inequities, we had a system that was the most capable of addressing those disparities and improving everyone's lives. That view was now considered naive at best, both by my left-leaning community of entertainers and the angry Capitol mob that wanted to lynch the vice president. I harbored hopes that we were still capable of rescuing ourselves from this vicious undertow of social disillusion, but I was losing faith that we had the sense or will to pull ourselves out. I coined my own pseudo-historical term. In the manner of famous periods such as the Enlightenment or the Era of Good Feelings, I felt this present moment should be known as the Great Unraveling. It was my moniker to describe the entropy I felt to be unfolding in every corner of the world I knew. I believed many others must share this feeling of things coming untethered all at once, on levels ranging from the global to the cellular. What is one to do when things fall apart and the center cannot hold? Douglas Adams's timeless advice of "don't panic" never made more sense to me. Finding peace in change did not seem so much a matter of achieving calmness during a storm, but more like consciously experiencing loss for what it was. The only true refuge was clarity of mind, because suffering is a condition of being alive. I thought back through my own life and whatever hurts I had experienced and realized I'd never had it so good. I thought of Tuckman's book, A Distant Mirror, and its description of how the Black Death and the 100 Years' War had ravaged an ailing medieval civilization. These events presaged the end of the world as people knew it, but were then followed by the flowering of the Renaissance. I believe I shared some of these thoughts during my group Zoom breakdown of the Capitol riot. I believe I'd also had a few whiskeys. Perhaps it was in light of this approaching apocalypse that Patrick floated a daring proposal that we put our names in for the lottery to hike Mount Whitney. Standing at 14,505 feet, Mount Whitney is the highest peak in the lower 48 states. It is the pinnacle of the Sierra Nevada mountains, located 3.5 hours north of LA in Inyo National Forest near the town of Lone Pine, California. The trail is well maintained, requires no technical expertise or equipment, and attracts hikers from all over the world for its elevation and beauty. Permits are required to hike the summit to limit the number of visitors and are attainable through a lottery system. Some permits allow for overnight camping at the two sites along the Mount Whitney Trail, but the majority are for only 24 hours, meaning the applicant must make the daunting 21-mile high-altitude climb of 6,646 feet in a single day. It's not a trek to be underestimated and requires preparation. For the amateur hiker, Whitney should only be attempted between June and October. Any time outside of that window, one is almost certain to encounter snow and ice, which would require mountaineering experience. Patrick's proposal to enter the lottery fell on mostly deaf ears in our group. Zach bluntly responded that it was too arduous and not his idea of fun. Vince planned on being busy with work through the summer and couldn't commit to a date. I figured there was no harm in applying, so I filled out the $5 application on recreation.gov for a party of 4 and designated Patrick as my alternate. I was asked to provide 15 different possible dates should I be chosen. After some research, I decided to pick the 2 weeks on either side of the full moon for the following August. Our chances seemed slim at best. It was an aspirational goal, but as is true for hiking in general, the journey was more important than the destination. By March, COVID vaccines were becoming available. It was the first good news in a year, and only a matter of months before we were supposedly all free to resume our normal lives. Hope rose on the first balmy winds of spring, and I was eager to get back out onto the trail. Jenny and I would drive to Griffith Park on Friday afternoons. I'd stick Hud in a backpack, and we'd stroll up and down the slopes facing Glendale. Hud was 30 pounds by this time, and carrying him for 7 miles made for decent exercise. It was just becoming a sweet family tradition until I pressed Jenny beyond her comfort zone with a stiff walk into the Verdugos on the Beaudry Loop, a trail that relentlessly climbed 1,500 feet to Tongva Peak. I also made the mistake of starting too late. The sun had dipped behind the Hollywood Hills by the time we began our descent. Hud shivered in his backpack as an evening breeze picked up. It was fully dark by the time we reached the car. Jenny was furious at me, convinced that I was trying to break us up by leading her into a Bataan death march. Although she finally chose not to leave me, it was clear that I needed to resume more challenging hikes with my friends, because I learned that we had been chosen. Toward the end of March, I received an email from recreation.gov that I was granted a 24-hour permit to hike Mount Whitney on August 23, 2021. My stomach dropped. It had suddenly become real, with an actual date. I knew that we could bow out at any time, but now Patrick and I would have to start training in earnest. We researched preparatory hikes from Mount Whitney, and I learned about the six-pack. The six-pack is not a reference to a finely sculpted abdomen, although that wouldn't impede your success, but to 6 mountains in the greater Los Angeles area that provide the distance, altitude, and elevation gain necessary in training for Whitney. They are Mount San Gorgonio, Mount San Bernardino, Mount San Jacinto, Mount Wilson, Cucamonga Peak, and Mount San Antonio, more commonly known as Baldy. All of these hikes were at least 12 miles long and gained over 3,000 feet of elevation. 4 of them had summits of over 10,000 feet above sea level, where the air starts to get thin. However, in April, most of these peaks were still capped in snow, so we began with a series of lower altitude, longer distance hikes, such as the 15-mile Bulldog Loop through Malibu Creek State Park that passes through the remains of the 4077th camp from MASH. We committed to reviving the peak of the week. Just as Patrick and I were getting into a routine, I was seized by back spasms, incurred ironically by doing leg strengthening exercises for my aching knee. I had recently had an MRI of my left knee that revealed a small tear in the meniscus, the soft tissue behind the kneecap that cushions the space between the femur and the tibia. Within minutes after following the doctor's recommended series of muscle-strengthening exercises, I was writhing on the floor with back pain, a casualty of that debilitating click in the spine that incapacitates middle-aged people, often incurred by sneezing or opening a window. When the spasms had subsided and I was able to stand upright, I paid a visit to Zach's wife, Tracy. She's an orthopedic surgeon with a specialty in sports medicine and the trusted professional source for Zach and his friend's joint issues. Patrick had already been to see her. Now I brought her the MRI film of my knee. She took a quick look at my tiny meniscus tear and surmised that I would most likely need arthroscopic surgery at some point. I explained that I had a date to hike Mount Whitney in August with Patrick and that we were trying to hit a peak a week. Tracy smiled compassionately and gave me a couple of cortisone shots instead. They were remarkable. The swollen ache subsided quickly and I was able to resume training. To ease back in, I suggested a moderate 10-mile hike up Mount Lukens, which stood 5,000 feet above Glendale. Declan had been away in Missouri for a couple of months, but heard about the Whitney venture and was keen to join us. The morning after he drove back to town, he met Patrick and me at the trailhead. As a peak, Lukens was unremarkable. The mountaintop widens out onto a large plateau manned by heavy vehicles and utility buildings that service a large field of antennas. We only stayed long enough to wolf down our summit sandwiches before a hazy view of the more attractive San Gabriel Front Range peaks like Strawberry and Josephine. On the way down, we overshot our turnoff and descended a canyon trail that ended in a dry riverbed. Patrick checked his phone. He had newly installed the All Trails app, which pinpointed his progress along the trail as well as recorded his distance traveled and altitude gained. Now he solemnly declared that we had to retrace our steps 1.5 miles back uphill to get out. It can be dispiriting to have to march back up a mountain you thought you were at the bottom of. A 10-mile hike magically turns into 12, and the fatigue is twice as enervating. The hot afternoon sun beat down as we wound our way up out of the canyon, and I suddenly heard a noise behind me. Declan was hauling himself up into a sitting posture after stumbling over a loose rock. A long gash bled down his elbow. His face was red and sweaty, his eyes glazed from dehydration and low blood sugar. I gave him water and a date bar. He explained that he hadn't slept much after his long drive the day before and had eaten neither dinner nor breakfast that morning. Also, he'd only brought 2 pint-sized bottles of water. My mind flashed back to the Baldy hike, of how very crucial water had been at a moment of panic and potential crisis, and recognized a lesson being taught to me a second time. Across the valley, clusters of houses clung to the hillside. Cars sped by like tiny beetles on the thin gray strip of the 210. Civilization was a few short miles away, And yet I understood how you could still perish in this wilderness, buried in the mountainous folds of urban sprawl. We followed Lukens with a hike up Mount Wilson, the first of the six-pack. I wore a pair of new Ultra Lone Peak hikers that Jenny gave me for my birthday, feather light with a wide toe box and a gummy sole for excellent traction. They were the correct choice for what turned out to be a foot-burning 17-mile slog up to Wilson's observatory from the suburb of Sierra Madre, then over a traverse and down an adjoining trail into Bailey Canyon. The descent was an endless Jacob's ladder of switchbacks that, after an hour, seemed to bring us no closer to the bottom. Declan called out the number of sharp, zigzagging turns to break up the monotony as the path dropped down further and further. Patrick groaned that we'd entered some sort of space-time vortex that continually brought us back to the same strip of trail in an endless loop. The last of the sunset glowed in the sky as we made it back to our cars. I called Jenny to let her know I was all right. I told her we would be out for 8 hours. It turned out to be 10. Mount Wilson gave us our first real taste of what a grueling all-day endurance hike was like. Over the next month and a half, Patrick and I forged ahead alone after Declan needed to return to Missouri for an extended period. In that time, the two of us would hike Mount Baden-Powell on the north ridge of the San Gabriels, through thick pine forest up into alpine tundra where crumpled evergreens bent and twisted like loose spools of suspension bridge cable. We cast off into the Cucamonga wilderness to cross Cucamonga, Bighorn, and Ontario peaks in a single day, rambling up and down slopes, bushwhacking through Manzanita, me forging ahead with my lungs burning while Patrick came up slow and splay-footed, stalking down the miles like a pilgrim between shrines. I collected large pine cones and chunks of white granite and rose quartz for Jenny to adorn our yard with. The following week found us crouched over and blasted by chilly 35-mile-an-hour winds on the arête of the Devil's Backbone, the earth shearing off into abyss on both sides of the narrow path as we ascended the eastern approach to Baldy. Another week, and we sweltered in 100-degree heat, leaning into our poles and clawing our way up a slippery, trackless incline to the top of forlorn Fox Mountain, buried in Big Tahunga Canyon. We walked the 3 T's trail off the Icehouse Saddle across Timber, Telegraph, and Thunder Mountain until we slid down a long rivulet of scree beneath the ski lift connecting Baldy Notch to Manker Flat. Trails became as recognizable as neighborhood streets. Peaks we'd visited stood out like familiar friends. We learned their faces from different angles and understood them in greater depth. Before the end of June, we traveled out to the mountain village of Idlewild in Riverside County for an 11-hour, 19-mile trek up the second highest of the six-pack, Mount San Jacinto. This trail rambled through numerous microclimates, ranging from dry granite, boulder, and pine forest to riparian meadows bursting with waist-high ferns, fed by cold trickling mountain springs that tasted of grass and stone. To summit San Jacinto at 10,834 feet, we climbed over huge piles of jagged monoliths that suddenly fell away to one of the most spectacular views I've ever seen. The mountain dropped down a vertigo-inducing escarpment 8,000 feet to the floor of the San Gorgonio Pass. The Coachella Valley rolled far out to the east toward the Salton Sea, the city of Palm Springs as clear as it might look on a survey map. To the north, Desert Hot Springs and Joshua Tree National Park looked close enough to parachute into. And just across I-10 was Mount San Gorgonio itself, rising above the dark horizon of the San Bernardinos like the hunched back of a giant. Patrick and I hiked well together. I often walked ahead of him, but we never lost sight of each other. He never protested when I chose to follow an overgrown route off the beaten path, in spite of a painfully aggravated bursa sac on his heel. We had lengthy conversations followed by long silences where we listened to nothing but our footsteps and our own busy thoughts. It's important to be able to comfortably share silence with someone you walk with for 10 hours a week. I believe this affinity had something to do with our shared interest in meditation. I sought to make hiking a walking meditation, to feel my feet on the ground and the air on my face, to allow time to pass at its own pace and not to hurry, to experience the journey as an end unto itself, to accept the aches in my joints as I would the warm sunshine on my skin, to become part of the mountain as if my flesh and bone were being ground down with every step into dust that would mingle with the ageless pebbles that had been trod upon for thousands of years. Patrick and I also both liked going to the Mount Baldy Lodge afterwards for beer and nachos grande. During the last week of June, we learned there was a wildfire up at Mount Whitney. The Inyo Creek fire was apparently caused by lightning strikes in the area, and the Forest Service closed the Whitney Portal trailhead and began evacuating hikers on June 22nd, with all hiking and camping permits canceled through the 27th. I thought of all the people who'd been granted permits months before, only to be disappointed at the last minute. Conditions were more tentative than ever due to the frequency of seasonal fires, and I hoped that the trail would be open for August. Patrick and I took a hiatus in July, as we both had to be out of town for a couple of weeks. Before I left, however, Declan returned and wanted to hike. He was still committed to joining us at Whitney. I was a bit skeptical. Patrick and I had been training consistently with increasing difficulty. I had purchased a fantastic guidebook called One Best Hike, Mount Whitney by Elizabeth Wenck, and read about the perils of high-altitude sickness and life-threatening edema of the brain and lungs. We would be looking at a 15-hour hike that would start at 2 or 3 in the morning. I recalled the long descent down San Jacinto and how the last 4 miles dragged on as if they were 10. Declan's stumble on Mount Lukens jumped to mind as well, and I was nervous about whether he would be able to train enough in the time we had left. I suggested that he and I climb the Baldy Bowl together. It had now been a year since Zach, Vince, and I made our unanticipated journey up that trail, and I was curious to experience it again. Declan was only available on the weekend, so we met up at the parking lot at Manker Flat at 6:30 on a Saturday morning. We were just able to grab the last 2 available parking spots. I hadn't hiked on a weekend before. Passing by the San Antonio Falls and up the Baldy Bowl Trail, I was stunned by the crowds of people. Over the past pandemic year, Americans had flocked to the national parks for accessible, socially distanced recreation. Campsites were booked months in advance, and several of the most famous parks, like Yosemite, were newly requiring advance reservations. Now, here on Baldy, we were suddenly among the press of humanity during peak hours, making way to allow groups of 4 and 5 hikers at a time squeeze past us. "It's like Six Flags," Declan observed, as an elderly hiker with white hair loped past us up the murderously pitched bluff above the Baldy Bowl. I was anxious to establish a decent pace that we could match at Whitney, and I knew I was pushing Declan a bit. He came up the trail, powerful torso rocking slightly from side to side like a metronome, his bow-legged gait the result of old knee injuries sustained through years of playing competitive rugby. We took frequent breaks. He was feeling the strain of the steep ascent and the rapidly thinning air. I, too, was surprised to discover that the bowl trail still made my heart pound in a way few others could. 100 yards from the top, the same sinewy, white-haired older man jogged past us on his way down, outpacing us at a rate that bruised my ego. At the Baldy summit, we found dozens of visitors. retirees in turtlenecks, a group of 10-year-olds in shorts and sneakers, a heavy-set couple with parasols, rocker dudes with long hot-ironed hair, skin-tight jeans, and leather vests, a punk rock dude pulling a wheelie on a mountain bike. A group of people stood in line to take photos in front of the summit marker. They waited while a blonde surfer girl in high-cut shorts stole attention by doing complicated YOLO yoga poses that she could post to social media. 2 thoughts went through my mind. 1, never hike on a weekend again. And 2, anyone can do this. It's just walking. All you have to be is willing. While Declan lay down to take a cat nap against a pile of stones, I wandered over to the north side of the broad massif and gazed out toward the sheep wilderness. Pine Mountain and Dawson Peak, the second and third highest elevations in the San Gabriels, stood close by like stepping stones for titans. Not a soul was visible anywhere on them. Just then, a tall, lightly outfitted fellow with long auburn hair sauntered past me on his way down the slope. I asked him if he was following the North Backbone Trail and whether it was passable. He confirmed that it was and explained that he had hiked up the far side of Pine by himself, carrying enough water to make camp. He pointed out a thick stand of evergreens, perhaps 2 miles distant, that spilled down the western face of the mountain where he'd bivouacked. He was currently on his way back from a training hike as he was going to compete in a high-altitude marathon in Utah soon. I wished him the best on his race. "And good luck on your adventures," he replied, flashing a puckish smile that radiated self-confidence. He dropped down the barely discernible trail. I watched until he vanished into the empty landscape, feeling that I had just encountered a spirit. The moon and stars were still bright in the indigo dawn as I turned off Route 138 up the Angeles Crest Highway, my headlights probing the sharp curves that rose through the hills around Wrightwood. By 6 a.m., I was parked in a residential neighborhood on a slope above town. I locked my car, set the All Trails app on my phone, and padded up a street past a Catholic sleepaway camp called St. Edward Retreat. Within minutes, I approached a dead end where the last of the dark, silent houses stood. Set between 2 private lots was a rough sign with an arrow pointing the way up a path called the Acorn Trail. I followed the narrow track alongside a fence and into the trees beyond. I was alone. It was 2 weeks before the Whitney hike. I had been eager to get back out ever since I'd returned from visiting my mother at the end of July. Outside of a scenic 10-miler in the Catskills, I hadn't trained in weeks. On my return from New York, I emailed Patrick and Declan to schedule our last few hikes. That was when Patrick broke the news that he was dropping out because he had contracted COVID. He was fully vaccinated, but fell victim to a breakthrough infection, possibly from the Delta variant of the virus. He was unable to work and was quarantining at home with recurrent flu-like symptoms. I was crestfallen. I wanted to cancel. It was Patrick who had suggested entering the permit lottery back in February. We'd been working toward this together for months, and now it felt like another good thing ruined by this plague year. The whole endeavor suddenly felt lonely and forbidding. Declan still wanted to continue with our plan, but on this day his work schedule prevented him from accompanying me to the North Backbone Trail. I'd been fascinated by this trail for weeks, which crossed both Pine Mountain and Dawson Peak before climbing Baldy's summit from the north side. The research I'd done about it turned up vague, even contradictory accounts, but all recommended approaching the ascent up Pine with caution. It was not a route many people explored, and I wanted it. If I summited Pine and Dawson, I would have bagged the 5 highest peaks in the San Gabriel Range. So I rose at 4 a.m. to drive out to Wrightwood to attempt the North Backbone by myself. After climbing 2 hours, the Acorn Trail intersected with the Blue Ridge Highway, a service road that actually made part of the Pacific Crest Trail. The town of Wrightwood and my car lay far behind me, down in a sleepy canyon obscured by forest. I followed the Blue Ridge for a mile to the east in an easy stroll along the wide, flat road, soaking in this fresh view of the northeastern range. A tall, broad-shouldered mountain bristling with pines revealed itself across an expanse to the south. It was still half in shadow from the rising sun, but I could clearly see a flinty ridge, bare of vegetation, that pointed up the mountainside like a wraith's finger. Half a mile later, I saw the sign for the North Backbone Trail. It abruptly dipped down from the Blue Ridge Highway before swooping up the side of Pine Mountain. I paused to eat some dried pineapple and take a long drink of water. I hadn't encountered a single soul since I left my house. It was unlikely that I would meet one along this remote stretch of trail. I unpacked my poles for the first time that day and discovered that I couldn't get the cleat to fasten on one of them. Dismissing the thought that this might be a bad omen, I scrambled down the rolling trail with a single pole. The trail narrowed to shoulder width as it climbed like the first big hill of a roller coaster. Then all of a sudden, it seemed to disappear into thin air. I stopped beside a scraggly pine to orient myself and glimpsed what seemed like little more than a deer track curling around the side of a slope composed entirely of loose gravel. I switched my pole to my downslope hand and stepped lightly onto the track. 200 feet out, it dwindled to a trace, with no larger trail in sight. I gently slid my phone from my pocket to check the map and saw that I was off trail. As I turned to backtrack, gravel trickled down the long incline in tiny avalanches underneath my boots. I kept my eyes straight ahead while retracing my steps and resisted the impulse to hurry for solid ground. For a dizzy moment, I wobbled off balance and caught sight of the slope that fell away, disappearing into the trees far below. Would this be the worst way to go, I wondered? Doing something I enjoyed? If I lost my footing, I'd never be able to climb back up, and no one would know where I was. The prospect of injury, followed by a miserable death from exposure in a trackless canyon, sounded challenging. Also, Jenny would be livid. Don't fall under any circumstances, I told myself, regaining footing. Just don't do it. Once back on terra firma, I saw how I had lost the trail as it ran unmarked up over a rocky spine. I clambered up onto the bare knife-edged ridge, the wraith's finger I had seen from a distance. A fresh morning breeze reddened my cheeks as I clung to the spine with hands and feet, chunks of flaky schist and scree tumbling down the slope behind me. Across the valley, the broad southern face of Mount Baden-Powell glowed white in the sun. I made a mental note to take particular care when I descended this rock slide on my way back. Don't overexhaust yourself, counseled my wiser angels as I leaned on my one pole. Just don't do it. The daffy sleepiness of high altitude made me yawn as I crested Pine. I paused to catch my breath among the evergreens and dark shattered rock that covered the summit. Then I continued down the opposite slope, which flowed into a gently graded rise to Dawson Peak. At the top of Dawson, I paused and took silent satisfaction in having hiked the 5 highest peaks in the San Gabriels. To the south, Baldy's double-humped crown dominated the cloudless blue horizon. I stopped and stared at the looming peak, tantalizingly close, and thought of the ultra-marathoner who I'd met before he descended this little-used bit of trail. Here it dipped down once more before rising a final 1,300 feet to the Baldy summit. I imagined how fatigued I'd be when I reached the top and how long I would have to rest before returning. I tried to factor in how much energy I'd consume summiting Dawson and Pine again before facing that sheer slippery ridge on the way back down. Just then, I spotted something in the air over Baldy. A large helicopter was hovering near the summit. It was too distant to be certain, but it looked like a search and rescue operation. "Just don't do it," I repeated, and snapped a picture of Baldy's northern face before regretfully turning and making my way back toward Pine Mountain. I needed a new backpack. I'd been using a simple black day pack stamped with some medical supply company's decal. It was a cheap piece of corporate swag that Jenny picked up for me at a thrift store, and it had served me well, but after I'd assembled all my supplies for Whitney, I could see that it was just too small. Even after years of travel, I tend to overpack, always fearing some unseen situation in which washing machines became completely unavailable and I would need a seventh pair of socks. After reading my guidebook on Whitney and its potential hazards, I resolved to prepare diligently. The list of necessaries included a waterproof windbreaker, a fleece jacket for warmth, a full change of clothes should I get wet, thermal underwear, a sun hat, a winter cap, gloves, a first aid kit, a reflective thermal blanket should I get stranded on the mountain for the night, a water filtration system, a flashlight, a headlamp, sunblock and lip balm with the highest UV protection available, a knife, a lighter or matches, a whistle and a mirror should I get lost, a compass, a paper map, an ample supply of energy-boosting snacks, my summit sandwich, and 4 or 5 liters of water. The list also included 2 WAG bags. WAG stands for Waste Alleviation and Gelling, and the bags are used for the removal of excrement, which doesn't decompose above a certain elevation. Leaving one scat on the mountain is against park regulations, as well as being considered generally irresponsible and unneighborly. I made a trip to REI in Burbank, where I purchased a new medium-sized internal frame pack with almost 2,000 cubic inches of space and plenty of pockets for around $160. It was an REI house brand, which ran about $50 less than the Gregory or Osprey brands and came in pumpkin orange. I threw in a couple of extra Nalgene liter water bottles, and I was set to go. I picked up Declan at 4:30 a.m. the following Monday. He quietly slipped out of his dark house and threw his new backpack, the same exact pumpkin orange REI pack, into the trunk next to mine. It seemed we'd make a handsome couple together out on the Whitney Trail, exactly 1 week hence. Now we sped east on the 210 toward our final dress rehearsal, a 19-mile out-and-back trek up Mount San Gorgonio. The San Bernardino Mountains are the highest of the transverse ranges, as well as the most easterly, running from the Cajon Pass out to the Coachella Valley. Like an impenetrable keep, San Gorgonio lies deep in the heart of the range, soaring to 11,503 feet, the highest point in Southern California. I had been looking forward to reaching this milestone for the past 9 months. Blue morning had just broken as we pulled into the parking lot at the Vivian Creek trailhead. Shouldering our pumpkin packs, we crossed a wide, dry riverbed called Mill Creek before the trail shot a mile up a steep incline into the San Gorgonio wilderness. 3 miles in, and we'd entered a new biome. The elevated shelf we found ourselves on was a lush canopied forest of enormous Jeffrey and Ponderosa pines nourished by Vivian Creek bubbling down the slope. I was reminded of the planet Endor from The Return of the Jedi, although I knew fully well that Ewoks were indigenous to the redwoods of Northern California. The trail wound its way east into a valley that rose between twin ridges of steep, vaulting peaks that crested 9,000 feet as we climbed deeper into the maw of the San Bernardinos. At about 5 miles, a long oscillating set of switchbacks mounted a ridgeline where we were hit with the acrid stink of smoke. The opposite slope dropped away from the trail into a blackened valley, stretching up the next ridge dotted with the skeletons of charred trees. This was the remains of the apple fire from the destructive summer of 2020 that left large swaths of the San Bernardino forest impassable. Across the ruined forest to the south, the sheer rocky face of San Jacinto stood like an eroded pyramid through the haze that hung over I-10. Declan and I turned away from this melancholy vista to ascend the ridge. Another mile and we were above the tree line where the air became thin. San Gorgonio hosts the largest alpine zone in the Transverse Ranges, and now the terrain transitioned from dwarfed lodgepole pines to a sloping, dun-colored plain of scrub, sand, and broken quartz. It was reminiscent of the top of Baldy, but where that summit fit neatly like a cap atop the peak, this consisted of an ecologic zone, large, sprawling, and undefined. My poles crunched in the sand as I sucked in the diminished oxygen like a parched man sipping from a stream. We were truly in the middle of a desert. The last 2 miles continued upward through this waste, the summit invisible, always further on. Declan and I passed a few descending hikers who finally directed us toward a 10-foot-high mound of rubble with a hand-painted sign that read, Mount San Gorgonio. We dropped our identical packs. The peak confounded my expectations. This unassuming pile of rocks sat on a massively broad and barren plateau that also housed a few subsidiary pinnacles before gradually falling away on all sides. The view apparently has the longest recorded line of sight in the lower 48 states, but everything seemed too far away to put into scale. The closest neighboring peaks looked as if they were in the next county. I tried to orient myself toward the San Gabriels to the west, but was unsure of what peaks I was seeing through the thin gauze of moisture and pollution that hung like cigarette smoke over a poker table. We settled down to lunch. I'd just swallowed a few bites of my summit sandwich when Declan threw up. He couldn't keep food down and admitted he had a headache, clear symptoms of altitude sickness. I got up to hand him some water, and as I turned back, the fattest chipmunk I've ever seen lumbered off with half my sandwich. He had an accomplice who made a play for the other half, but I whisked it away before he got his paws on it. We didn't tarry, since the only real cure for altitude sickness is to get to lower elevation. Typically during a descent, Declan would regale me with stories of his past adventures, such as line fishing for salmon in a storm off the coast of Alaska, or playing in a 3-day card game with forest rangers while trapped in a cabin during an avalanche on Mount Denali. This day, he was uncharacteristically quiet as we made our way back down the long trail. I'd try to pick up the pace until Declan would stop for a spell. During one such break, we were overtaken by a couple we'd seen at the summit. Declan and I would pass them several more times on the way down, leapfrogging each other as we each took our respective breathers. By 4 p.m., we still had over 5 miles to go, and I became keenly aware of the angle of the sun as it filtered through the large pines in the gold of late afternoon. I thought of how long the last 4 miles had been when Patrick and I descended San Jacinto back in June, how my mind started to drift away as my aching feet stumbled down the rocky path in a trail version of white line fever. We were just about 4 miles from the end when Declan dropped his pack against a fallen tree and lay down. Eyes closed, he took deep measured breaths, as if he were silently trying to will sickness from his body. Our companion couple shortly overtook us and asked if everything was all right. I gave a thin smile and assured them that we were fine and would be moving along any moment. They continued on, but from that point on, I noticed that they never got so far ahead of us that we lost sight of each other. They were clearly staying close in case we had a problem. The forest arched over us in the dusk, now less reminiscent of Endor and more of Grimm's fairy tales. I became impatient and urged Declan to his feet, knowing we still had miles to go. It was 7 p.m. by the time we reached the car. The sky was the same hue as when we'd started out 13 hours earlier. Even though this hike was an equal distance to the one on San Jacinto, it had taken 2 hours longer to complete. I was quiet as we loaded up the car and drove west out of the Long Canyon back toward Route 38. Declan had recovered by this time and was back to his normal gregarious self. As he recounted the day, he declared that even though there were setbacks and lessons learned, it was, on the whole, a success. Was it? I asked peevishly. Because to be honest, I have concerns. I'm not sure you should climb Whitney. Night fell with a disconcerting pall as I drove back toward Declan's house in Highland Park. In 4 days, we were supposed to travel up to Lone Pine together to begin acclimating before the big hike on Monday. He explained that he was sleep-deprived from working nights the entire last week and that he planned to take medication to combat the altitude sickness. I admitted that I had been uncertain about his condition since Mount Lukens back in April and now was more worried than ever. I added that I knew he wouldn't back down from a challenge, that he'd push past his limits, and I didn't want to get into a dangerous situation on Whitney, particularly one in which we were descending after sunset. 90 minutes later, I pulled up to his place. Declan turned to me, leveling me with his gaze. I understand if you'd rather do this alone. Good luck on Monday, he said, and climbed out of the car. It was close to 9 by the time I got home. Jenny drew me a hot bath and handed me a glass of bourbon as I related the day's events to her. I felt terrible about how I had left things with Declan, and was now considering hiking Whitney on my own, or perhaps joining up with a group once I got there. She listened carefully before responding. You need to talk to him, she said. Declan may have to turn around up there, but you could too. You have no idea what's going to happen on Whitney, but you're not going to hike it alone. Stop being crazy and just trust that things will turn out the way they should. I took a swig of bourbon and sunk lower into the bathwater. I knew I could get to the top, and I didn't want to have to turn around for someone else. I was ready. The idea of not making it was more than disappointing. It was demoralizing. Then I thought of my friends and remembered that the camaraderie and the stories shared were the sweeter dividends of accomplishment. Summiting a peak was more gratifying when done with someone else who could also appreciate the experience. It somehow becomes more real. What is an experience if it only exists in one person's memory? Over time, it takes on the aspect of a daydream. I was holding on too tight. I needed to relax because I knew I didn't want to hike Whitney by myself. 4 days later, Declan and I were driving together up 395 bound for Lone Pine. I had called to apologize, and he told me that he appreciated my candor and concerns. I was grateful that he didn't hold a grudge and felt a weight lifted. He'd also gotten a prescription for Diamox, a medication to help with the altitude sickness. We shot up north fast in high spirits, coasted into the Lone Pine Visitor Center to pick up our permit, and straight into a dense cloud of smoke. It hung low, clinging to the town like a web. Getting out of the car, it smelled as if all of Lone Pine was on fire. The Dixie Blaze had already destroyed 1,000,000 acres of Northern California with no signs of abating. It is the first known fire to burn over the crest of the Sierra Nevada mountains. To this was added the Caldor Fire, which was eating up the area around Lake Tahoe and causing mass evacuations just a couple of hours north. I estimated that the smoke was blowing south from there and settling in the Owens Valley between the Sierra Nevada and Death Valley. I was unsure if we should be staying there at all. Declan and I picked up our permit from the ranger, plus a couple of free wag bags for the taking. Lone Pine has been a popular location for Hollywood film shoots for about a century, from the Hopalong Cassidy serials to exotic epics like Gunga Din, and even more recent actioners such as Iron Man. The town itself is something of a standing set, further augmented by the neighboring mountains and desert. Declan and I checked into the Dow Villa Motel, an establishment dating back to the 1920s, the lobby of which is festooned with faded black and white production stills from famous and forgotten westerns. The front desk supplies multiple copies of Gunga Din for the guests' viewing pleasure. Instead of taking in a movie, we took our first dose of Diamox and set our alarms to awaken at 4 a.m. I wanted to begin adjusting to our start time 2 days hence. After estimating how long the Whitney hike could take us, I decided that we should get on the trail by 1 o'clock in the morning and aim to get to bed before sundown in the 2 days leading up to it. During those 2 days, we made a couple of short hikes to help acclimate to the altitude. One of these was in Onion Valley, located north of Lone Pine, where we hiked about 4 miles out past a succession of small, clear mountain lakes. Immediately, I could see that we were in a different environment. The Sierra Nevada is a 400-mile-long chain that runs north to south between California and Nevada in a line of high barrier peaks. These mountains are a strand of the American Cordillera, the massive braid of continental ranges that stretches all the way down North and South America. Rising in a towering row of sharp granite teeth, they look nothing like the lower, blunter, tree-covered peaks of the transverse ranges. Along the trail, we met a man, a long trekker in his 70s, who told us that he had completed the entire Pacific Crest Trail from the Mexican to the Canadian border and had come south again. He was currently on a 300-mile solo, weaving in and out of the various passes, trying to stay out of the smoke. Even here, at higher than 9,000 feet, we could see and smell the screen of translucent white that filled the valleys like consommé. Declan and I watched the older man continue on his way, marveling at his determination, fitness, and... what? What makes a person walk seemingly impossible distances alone? Is it a desire to escape the tedium or difficulties of stationary life? Is it the empowerment that comes from knowing that nowhere is too far? Perhaps it's the discovery that life is in the real-time effort it takes to travel the liminal distances, and that the distractions of the civilized world amount to little more than phantasms. Or did he murder his wife? We discussed these possibilities over an early dinner before double-checking our packs for the following day. I set the alarm for midnight and pulled the shades down against the late afternoon sun before attempting to sleep. I wasn't quite sure if I awoke before the alarm or not, but I snapped the light on at 12 a.m. All I knew was that I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours, as I had expected. Declan and I grabbed our gear, loaded the car, and drove past the rocky piles of the Alabama hills in the dark, swaying with the hairpin turns as it climbed toward the Whitney portal. Approaching, we could see that the campsites around the trailhead were filled. A fat, round moon hung high in clear sky as we stepped onto the brightly lit trail at 1:45 in the morning. With the tang of smoke in our nostrils, we adjusted our headlamps to begin our journey at 8,300 feet, moving up the wooded trail. Ahead and behind us, we could see the halogen glow of other hikers bobbing in the dark like will-o'-the-wisps. It was like a pilgrimage, a long ribbon of people traveling alone or in small groups toward a remote mountain temple. 3 miles up, we heard the vigorous rush of water from a short falls. Our headlamps cast tall, disorienting shadows through a copse of thick-towering pines as we passed over Lone Pine Creek on a narrow gangplank. Beyond the pines, we entered a small flat meadow at the foot of a line of saw-blade peaks, lofty and bone-white, huge piles of broken talus arrested in mid-tumble banked against their slopes. Soon the trees closed in again as we came upon a short group of switchbacks. We were approaching the mountain in a series of tiers, steep uphill ascents broken up by long flat terraces as we moved ever westward toward the Sierra crest. At the Bighorn Wilderness, I could hear the trickling creek as we followed a path of duckboards around the reedy marsh. Thor Peak towered above us in the spectral light like a gigantic fang. A short rest, and then another flight of switchbacks that took us up past Mirror Lake and over to the other side of the canyon. I stood on a cliff above Mirror Lake and watched the pinpoints of headlamps moving up the trail a quarter mile ahead of us. Suddenly, I was startled by a strange whirring sound as a large black shadow shot by a few feet over my head. "Did you see the size of that owl?" Declan asked. The trail became rough and very uneven at this point as it transitioned from flat dirt to solid rock. In fact, it didn't seem like much of a trail at all as we stepped on the spurs of jagged boulders and slid between serrated canals of stone scarred by glacial melt. We were now above the tree line, higher than 10,000 feet. There was barely more vegetation than small tufts of the meanest grass. We had hiked perhaps 5 miles in. Dawn was breaking soon when I was seized by the urgent need for a pit stop. I hadn't actually believed that I would have to squat on the mountain at any point. I'd been in a state of retention for about 2 days and frankly had forgotten about it. Now I fumbled around in my pack for one of the wag bags. I found some privacy behind a boulder, dropped my hiking poles, and sat down to read the wag bag instructions while holding my flashlight in my mouth. Essentially, the kit consisted of 2 large trash bags, one with gelling powder in the bottom and the other to stow the first one in after you've done your business. I did mine heroically, stooped on a rough ledge in the dark chill of pre-dawn. It wasn't much further up the trail when we became aware of the morning light upon us. All at once, everything was bathed in faint gray-blue, the peaks of the Sierra crest clearly visible ahead, their points tipped with the glow of dawn. I turned to see Declan sharply silhouetted against the eastern horizon. It was rigidly bisected, Rothko-esque, a clear, starless blue void atop a deep, murky field of brown where the thick smoke of forest fire choked the lower plains, separated by strata of deep oranges and pale yellows that heralded the coming of the day. As we sipped some water, we saw that we were standing in the middle of a moonscape. There wasn't a sign of plant life anywhere, just a vast bowl of white broken rock hemmed in by a high skyline of bald, jagged spires. Only Consultation Lake on our left offered any sign of habitability. Then the sun broke out in earnest, painting the wall of bleached Savage Mountains ahead a bright, fiery orange, blazing before an empty sky. I pulled my gloves over my cold, numbed fingers. Shaggy young hikers emerged from a smattering of tents spread on either side of the path. We were passing through Trail Camp, which was situated at the foot of the infamous 99 switchbacks, the long, tortuous climb up to the ridgeline of serrated peaks. As we approached, it looked as if the trail disappeared into the rampart of insurmountable mountains that reached over 1,000 feet above. Then the switches revealed themselves as our elevation increased. Climbing higher and higher, we passed small patches of ice, careful to hold on to the steel cable railing that bounded the sheer cliffside. The top never seemed appreciably closer. My feet dragged, and I felt winded for the first time that day. Whether because we'd properly acclimated or the Diamox was doing its job, neither of us struggled with altitude sickness, but my lungs labored, and I felt as if I was wading through water. Oxygen had become scarce. It took us nearly 2 hours to reach the 1,600 feet to the top of the switchbacks. Looking back down at the plateau, I could trace our progress since daybreak. Consultation Lake was a tiny placid pool. The tents of trail camp were the size of fleas. Even the broad, hunchbacked summit of Wotan's throne at over 12,700 feet looked like a sandcastle. Then we stepped onto Trail Crest. I quickly dug into my pack for another thermal layer and my wool knit cap to protect me from the wintry blast of wind that blew through the narrow pass atop the Sierra. Some hikers hunkered down among the rocks for shelter. Others were coming towards us up the rocky, rolling path, and we learned that they'd approached Whitney from the west, traveling through from the John Muir Trail. With the sun climbing higher, Declan and I followed the Whitney Trail down into the shadow behind the sharp, chipped pinnacles that jabbed at the sky like the tines of a crown. It was 2 more miles to the summit. The trail was passable but rough, and we kept sharp eyes on our footing lest a careless misstep lead to a rapid trip to the bottom. The closer we got, the more my feet resisted. We moved slowly, careful not to overtax our oxygen intake. During one of our breathers, at a window between 2 pinnacles, we heard a bright greeting as a sporty young woman wearing aviator sunglasses approached. She pointed out a tiny purple blossom where we stood and informed us that it was known as Sky Pilot, a small flower that only grew at this elevation. She told us she was known as Solo, her hiking handle. Despite her name, she seemed eager to socialize. She explained that it was her wedding anniversary, and she was celebrating by hiking the John Muir Trail alone. I tried to estimate whether her husband wasn't much of an outdoor enthusiast or their marriage was in trouble. We told her that we were doing Whitney for our first time on a single-day pass. I've done that before, she winced. It's a bit much. By now, we were passing Crook's Peak, a sharp outcropping named for a woman who had hiked Whitney every year between the ages of 66 and 91. Rare company indeed. I looked ahead and saw a wide field of talus sweeping out to a broad, rounded point, perhaps 3/4 of a mile distant. Squinting, I could just make out the low profile of the famous Whitney hut that stood at the summit. I eked a sigh out of the thin air. It still seemed far. Our average speed of just over a mile an hour was slowing steadily. Solo, fresh as ever, strode on ahead, chatting with other hikers who could match her pace. "We are definitely on the low rung of the hiking food chain," Declan observed. I grudgingly agreed before I saluted Crook's Peak and plodded on toward the humped back of Whitney, a lifeless purgatory of nothing but broken gray rock and open sky. My eyes peered ahead for the hut on the horizon, my feet moving as if hands grasped at them. It was a mere few hundreds of yards away, the culmination of a year's preparation. I could already imagine setting my pack down and taking in the glorious panorama, savoring the balm of accomplishment when an uncomfortable sensation came over me. Not again, I thought. I stopped to dig the wag bag out of my pack and stepped off the trail to find a semblance of privacy in the bright 11 a.m. sunlight. I knew that the hut had no facilities and would be abuzz with hikers taking their well-deserved rest. There wasn't any place that was hidden from the trail. Rarely in life do we arrive in the manner that we hope, but I was too tired to be embarrassed. Declan and I made the last quarter mile to the low stone building, first built by Smithsonian astronomers in 1909. Hikers milled about, chatting, having lunch, taking pictures, and naps. We dropped our packs, rolled our necks and shoulders. Then we took our turn to hold aloft the stenciled steel sign that read, Mount Whitney, 14,505. Solo, who had preceded us, obligingly took our picture at the edge of the cliff looking to the southeast, but even at this altitude we could only see the closest neighboring peaks. The fires still created a visible haze, and the distant horizon was dark and obscured, but the pollution couldn't dampen our deep, deep satisfaction. I sat on a rock in the warm sun to enjoy my summit sandwich before grabbing a cat nap on the cold metal floor of the hut. We spent over an hour at the top, meeting some of our fellow summiteers. Close to 100,000 people apply for permits to hike this mountain every year. Only about 30,000 get drawn. Of those 30,000, only 10,000 make it to the top. We were now among the 10. Before beginning the long walk down, we signed the guest book at the hut where I left my regards to Patrick, Vince, Zach, and of course Jenny. They walked with us. It was 7:25 p.m. by the time we recrossed the Whitney portal in the August twilight. We had been on the trail for close to 18 hours. The numbness in my feet went unnoticed now, familiar as the backs of my hands. I was exhausted, but energized. There was none of the ossifying soreness that had crept over me after completing San Jacinto or even San Gorgonio just the week before. Even as Declan and I came to a halt by the car, the sensation of moving ever forward persisted, and I felt as if I would never come to rest. We had followed the trail back east against the sun's arc, taking in all the landscape that we'd missed in the darkness. The broken, bony section of path that connected Consultation and Mirror Lakes was clear as day and absolutely new. The thick green marshland of the Bighorn Wilderness looked like entirely different country, with Thor Peak presiding above like a wrinkled grandparent. We'd drunk fresh water from a trickling stream that had sprung out of the side of the 99 switchbacks. The last 3 miles felt the longest, as I had come to expect, but instead of counting the steps until I could stop, I imagined that there was no end, and the trail stretched on forever. A young, lean man named Orrin, with glasses and a red beard, joined Declan and I on our descent. He loped along beside us without tiring, provisioned with nothing but a couple of small water bottles. We'd hoped to enjoy a beer and burger together at the Whitney Portal store, but it was closed by the time we arrived. Instead, Orrin made a quick farewell and disappeared across the parking lot. The hike was over. Declan and I drove down to Lone Pine for a simple dinner before retiring back to the Dow Villa. Declan's wife, Christine, had presented us each with a gift-wrapped box before we left. We now opened them to find 2 rocks glasses with a topographical relief of Mount Whitney cut into the bases. I opened the bottle of whiskey that Jenny had packed for me, and we toasted our wives and each other. We were asleep before we finished our drink. 3 days after the hike, Jenny and I convened with friends and family on a Zoom session with a judge from the San Diego County Court. In a brief and genial proceeding, we formally adopted HUD as our son, a process that had taken more than 2 years. That weekend, Patrick and his wife Celeste hosted a party for us. Our friends brought gifts and ate summer salad and drank Sauvignon Blanc on the patio by the pool. The younger children ran around playing games. The older ones stood quietly near their parents, uncertain of how they should interact. Some guests still wore masks, not having attended an event of this size for some time. The day was the type that makes LA so seductive, bright, breezy, and warm as a loving embrace. I was among my West Coast family, the people with whom I'd grown lasting roots during my time in California. Declan was among them, and we regaled our friends with pictures and stories from our weekend up at Whitney. I tried to describe how the dawn lit up the mountain crest like fire and attempted to put in perspective a photo taken of Lake so far down that it might have been snapped from the window of an airplane. But somehow it felt as if I was describing a movie I had seen and not something I had lived. I was growing unsure of whether I could still recall the experience itself. It was a goal accomplished and an event that would always define 2021 for me, but was I any different for it? It remained to be seen whether I'd found an enduring passion or just a temporary distraction from loss and upheaval. Instability is a condition of life. It's a human tendency to wish for an ideal stasis where worries are always pacified, desires are swiftly met, and satisfaction never fades. It took me quite a few years to realize that this circumstance doesn't exist, and more importantly, that it shouldn't. If anything, the difficulties of the last several years have made me understand how stable most of my life has actually been. Everything, from one's own family to nature itself, is impermanent, vulnerable to neglect, and demands replenishment. Just as the San Gabriel Mountains continue to thrust upward and crumble back as they grind against their fault lines, so do notions of self, identity, history, and values as they metamorphose under the frictions of time. It is our privilege to walk through the beauty and violence as the ground shifts beneath our feet.